My name is Clara Josephine Miller, though for the last 60 years I have been known as Mrs. Clara Hayes. I was born on the 2nd of September in the year 1839 in a small, isolated farming community in upstate New York near the shores of Lake Ontario. I am now 87 years old. I spend my days in a rocking chair by the window of my daughter's modern home in Syracuse, listening to the crackle of the radiophone and watching the electric street lamps flicker to life at dusk. The world has moved on so fast. It has washed away the dirt roads, the oil lamps, and the suffocating silence of the world I grew up in. I am considered a good woman by those who know me, a devoted widow, a quiet neighbor, a faithful congregant who never misses a Sunday service. But the soul is a dark and cavernous thing, and mine is stained with a sin so deep and so cowardly that not a single day of my long life has passed without its heavy, suffocating weight pressing down upon my chest. I destroyed a life. I did not use a knife or a gun or poison. I used a weapon far more insidious, far more common, and far more lethal in a tight-knit, God-fearing community. I used a lie. A single, calculated lie spoken out of spite and petty jealousy when I was just 17 years old. And that lie devoured the woman who had been my entire world. Her name was Abigail. Abigail Foster. To understand the depth of my betrayal, you must understand the absolute isolation of our youth and how completely intertwined our lives were. We were born just 3 weeks apart, our mothers having shared a midwife. In a village of perhaps 200 souls, where the winters were brutal and the labor was endless, Abigail was the only light I had. We were inseparable from the time we could walk. We shared our secrets sitting in the hayloft of my father's barn. We shared our meager dreams while picking blackberries in the late summer heat. We walked 2 miles to the one-room schoolhouse together, our hands mittened and clasped against the bitter New York cold. She was the sister my mother never gave me. But as we grew from children into young women, a chasm began to open between us, dug entirely by my own insecurities. Abigail grew into a creature of striking, undeniable beauty. She had hair the color of spun copper, skin that never seemed to burn in the summer sun, and a laugh that was loud, unrestrained, and entirely inappropriate for the rigid, pious expectations of our elders. People gravitated toward her. The younger children adored her. The older women smiled at her despite themselves, and the boys at school tripped over their own boots just to hand her a slate pencil. I, on the other hand, was painfully plain. I had dull, mud-brown hair, a severe face, and a quiet, brooding disposition. Where Abigail was sunshine, I was the damp earth underneath. For a long time, I did not mind. Being her shadow meant I was included in her light. She never treated me as inferior. She defended me against the cruelties of the older boys and insisted I sit beside her at every church social and harvest dance. She loved me genuinely with a pure, uncalculating heart. But the human heart is a treacherous thing, prone to the ugliest of diseases, and the disease that took root in me was envy. It did not bloom overnight. It was a slow, creeping rot, fed by every stolen glance a young man threw her way. Every compliment the minister's wife paid to her needlework, every time I stood beside her and felt entirely, agonizingly invisible. The breaking point arrived in the spring of 1856, when we were both 17. A new family, the Blackwoods, moved into the county to take over the old grist mill. They had a son named Elias. Elias was 20 years old, educated in Albany, and possessed a quiet, gentle confidence that immediately set apart from the rough, unpolished farm boys we had grown up with. He wore crisp shirts, spoke with a soft cadence, and had eyes that seemed to look right through the superficiality of our little village. Every unmarried girl in the county was instantly infatuated with him. I was no exception. For the first time in my life, I felt a desperate, all-consuming desire to be noticed. I spent hours brushing my dull hair, trying to mimic the way Abigail pinned hers. I ironed my best calico dress until the fabric was stiff. I prayed, actually prayed to God, that Elias Blackwood would look at me. But Elias did not look at me. From the very first Sunday the Blackwoods attended our church, his eyes found Abigail. And Abigail, for the first time in her life, was entirely captivated in return. It was agonizing to watch. They fell in love with a swiftness that left me breathless and sick with jealousy. Because our community was incredibly strict, courting was done on front porches under the watchful eyes of parents. They had to steal their moments. And because I was Abigail's shadow, I became their unwilling accomplice. I was the one who carried Elias's folded notes to her. I was the one who stood watch at the edge of the woods while they walked together in the twilight. I was forced to witness the way he looked at her as if she were the only woman God had ever bothered to create. Abigail confided everything in me, oblivious to the fact that her joy was slowly poisoning me. She told me about his plans to build a house on the eastern ridge, about the names they had laughingly picked out for children they did not yet have. She was so radiant, so completely happy that it felt like a physical assault upon my own lonely, plain existence. I felt discarded. I felt as though the only thing that had ever made me special, my proximity to Abigail, was being stolen from me by a man I secretly, desperately wanted for myself. And so, the rot in my heart finally reached the surface. It happened in the late days of August during the sweltering heat of the harvest season, when the air was thick with the smell of cut hay and impending thunderstorms. You must understand the nature of the community we lived in to comprehend how easily a life could be dismantled. Our village was governed by a rigid, unforgiving brand of Protestantism. Morality was not a private matter. It was violently public. A young woman's virtue was a fragile glass ornament, and the entire town watched it constantly, waiting for the slightest crack. If a girl's reputation was soiled, there was no redemption. She was forever marked, a cautionary tale whispered about at quilting bees and Sunday suppers. I knew this. I knew the absolute fatal power of a ruined reputation, and I wielded that knowledge with the precision of an executioner. The opportunity presented itself during the annual late summer camp meeting, a sprawling, week-long religious gathering held in a clearing a few miles from our village. It was the social and spiritual event of the year, drawing families from across the county. The days were filled with fire and brimstone sermons, and the evenings were chaotic with prayer circles and socializing. Abigail, bursting with the secret thrill of her romance, had arranged to meet Elias away from the lantern light, down by a bend in the creek that was shielded by thick weeping willows. As always, I was instructed to be her alibi. I was to sit near the edge of the congregation and, if her parents asked, claim she had gone to the necessary tent or was fetching water. I watched her slip away into the dusk, her copper hair catching the last rays of the dying sun. I sat on a hard wooden bench, listening to the preacher scream about the fires of hell, while the fire of my own resentment burned a hole through my stomach. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I knew Elias had been delayed. I had seen his father pull him into a deep conversation near the wagons just as Abigail had left. Unable to bear sitting still, I crept toward the creek, keeping to the shadows. When I found Abigail, she was alone, pacing nervously near the water. But before I could step forward and tell her Elias was detained, another figure emerged from the trees. It was Silas Vance. Silas was a hired hand who drifted from farm to farm, a man in his 30s known for his foul temper, his crude remarks, and his profound fondness for cheap whiskey. He was the kind of man respectable girls were taught to cross the street to avoid. He had clearly been drinking, stumbling slightly as he approached Abigail. I froze behind the trunk of a massive oak, watching. Silas cornered her against the bank of the creek. He slurred something I could not hear and reached out, grabbing her by the arm. Abigail visibly panicked. She violently wrenched her arm free, shoved him hard in the chest, and turned to run back toward the safety of the camp. The entire encounter lasted perhaps 30 seconds. It was entirely innocent on her part. She was a victim of a drunkard's harassment. She ran past my hiding spot without seeing me, her breath hitching with fear, desperate to get back to the light. I should have followed her. I should have comforted her. But as I watched her terrified retreat, a dark, venomous thought crystallized in my mind. If Elias believed Abigail was not the pure, untouched angel he thought she was, he would leave her. And if he left her, he would need someone to comfort him, someone quiet, respectable, and entirely devoted. Someone like me. I did not pause to consider the eternal consequences. I did not think of our shared childhood, or the thousands of kindnesses she had shown me. I thought only of Elias Blackwood's eyes and my own desperate, starving ego. Before we continue, a quick word. I've released 14 full recordings that will never be on YouTube. These are the voices too personal, too raw to share publicly, completely unedited, nothing cut. If you want access, the link is in the description. It's called The Lost Recordings, and getting it helps us keep making these videos. All right, back to the story. I waited until Abigail was safely back among the congregation, and then I tore at my own dress, pulling the collar askew. I pinched my cheeks until they were flushed and forced myself to hyperventilate, working up real tears of manufactured hysteria. I ran not to Abigail, but to my mother, who was sitting with the most prominent, gossip-hungry women of the church, including the minister's wife. I collapsed at my mother's feet, sobbing wildly, hiding my face in my hands. When they hauled me up and demanded to know what had frightened me, I unleashed the poison. I told them I had gone to the creek to fetch water and had stumbled upon a horrifying sight. I wept as I said the words, acting the part of the traumatized, innocent maiden. I told them I had seen Abigail Foster locked in a passionate, willing embrace with Silas Vance. I told them her dress was pulled down off her shoulder, that they were kissing in the shadows, and that when I gasped, they laughed at me. I layered the lie with devastating specific details that I knew these puritanical women would swallow like communion wine. I told them I had suspected it for weeks, that Abigail had been sneaking out, using me as a shield to hide her wicked, wanton behavior with the town drunk. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The women gasped, their faces draining of color before flushing with righteous, vindictive fury. My mother, practically vibrating with the thrill of possessing such scandalous information, immediately went to find Abigail's parents. The whisper spread through the camp meeting faster than a spark in dry tinder. In the span of an hour, the radiant, beloved Abigail Foster was transformed into a pariah, a harlot who had disgraced her family and defiled the holy gathering. I stood in the background as Abigail's father, a severe, unforgiving man whose pride was his religion, dragged her by the wrist to the center of their wagon camp. He demanded the truth. Abigail, weeping and utterly bewildered, frantically denied it. She looked around at the circle of accusing, disgusted faces, searching for a lifeline. And then, her desperate eyes found mine. "Clara," she pleaded, her voice cracking with terror. "Clara, tell them it's a lie. I was just walking. Please, Clara, tell them you didn't say this." The entire camp fell dead silent, waiting for my verdict. The weight of what I had done pressed against my throat, threatening to choke me. I could have recanted. I could have said I was mistaken in the dark. But my mother's hand was gripping my shoulder, and the pride of my own deception paralyzed me. I looked at the girl who had been my shadow, my sister, my only friend in the world. I looked directly into her terrified, pleading eyes, and I sealed her coffin. "I cannot lie to God, Abigail," I said, my voice remarkably steady. "I saw what I saw. I saw you with Silas." The sound that tore from Abigail's throat was not a sob. It was the sound of an animal caught in a steel trap. It was a sound of absolute, incomprehending betrayal. Her father did not hesitate. In our community, a father's righteous anger was the only acceptable response to a daughter's ruin. He struck her across the face with the flat of his heavy, calloused hand. The blow knocked her to the dirt. "You will not speak," he roared, his face purple with a terrifying holy rage. "You have brought shame upon this family. You have brought the devil into our camp." He hauled her up by her hair and dragged her toward their wagon. They packed their belongings in the dark and left the camp meeting before midnight. The swiftness of the destruction was breathtaking. By the time my own family returned to the village 3 days later, the story had grown, mutating as rumors do. The innocent struggle by the creek had become a sordid, ongoing affair. Because the lie had come from me, the quiet, devout, unremarkable best friend who had no reason to slander her. It was accepted as absolute, unassailable gospel. I waited in a state of sickening, nervous anticipation for Elias Blackwood. In my twisted, naive mind, I truly believed that once the shock wore off, he would see me. He would see that I had saved him from a wicked woman, and his gratitude would soften into affection. I was an absolute fool. The Blackwoods were a family of means and immense pride. When the rumors reached them, they did not demand an investigation. They severed the connection like a diseased limb. 2 days after we returned from the camp, I saw Elias riding his horse past our farm. I ran out to the fence, my heart pounding, rehearsing the words of comfort I would offer him, he stopped when he saw me. He looked down from his saddle, and the expression on his face completely hollowed me out. There was no gratitude. There was no affection. There was only a profound, devastating grief mixed with a cold, hard disgust. He did not look at me as a savior. He looked at me as the harbinger of his misery. He tipped his hat in a stiff, lifeless gesture, spurred his horse, and rode away. A week later, his father sent him back to Albany to work with an uncle. He never returned to our village. My lie had not brought him to me. It had driven him away forever. With Elias gone, I had nothing left but the terrifying reality of what I had done to Abigail. The punishment our village inflicted upon her was not physical, but it was a psychological execution. They called it the shunning. It was not a formal decree from the pulpit, but a collective, silent agreement among the righteous. From the moment she returned to her father's house, Abigail ceased to exist as a human being. If she walked into the general store, the conversation stopped instantly. The women would turn their backs to her, inspecting bolts of cloth or jars of molasses until she made her purchases and left. At church, she was forced to sit in the very last pew, isolated from the rest of the congregation. When the service ended, the aisle would clear, people pulling their skirts tight against their legs to avoid brushing against her as they filed out. Even the children, who had once adored her, were sharply pulled away by their mothers if she approached. But the worst cruelty occurred within the walls of her own home. Her father, consumed by the shame she had supposedly brought upon his name, forbade anyone in the family from speaking to her unless it was to issue a command for labor. She was moved from the warm bedroom she shared with her younger sisters to a drafty cot in the attic. She took her meals alone in the kitchen after the rest of the family had eaten. She was treated as a pariah, a contaminant that they were forced to house but refused to love. I watched this slow murder from a distance, paralyzed by my own cowardice. The guilt was a living, breathing thing inside my chest. It woke me in the middle of the night, slick with cold sweat, the memory of her terrified eyes at the camp, meeting burning in my mind. Every Sunday, I sat 3 pews ahead of her, feeling the weight of her presence like a physical pressure on the back of my neck. I could see the toll the isolation was taking. Within 3 months, the radiant, beautiful girl was gone. Her copper hair lost its luster, pulled back into a severe, uncaring knot. Her dresses hung loosely on a frame that was rapidly losing weight. The bright, loud laugh that had once filled my childhood was completely extinguished. The first snows of November fell, burying the village in a suffocating silent white. It was on one of those bitterly cold afternoons that I finally had to face her. I was walking back from the woodshed, my arms full of kindling, when I saw her standing by the edge of our property line. She wore a thin wool shawl, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She looked like a ghost. I froze, the wood heavy in my arms. I wanted to turn and run back to the safety of my house, but my feet were rooted to the frozen earth. She stepped over the boundary line and walked slowly toward me. When she was close enough that I could see the dark, bruised circles under her eyes, she stopped. She didn't look angry. She just looked broken. "Why, Clara?" she whispered. Her voice was cracked, unused from months of enforced silence. "What did I ever do to you that you would hate me so much?" My throat closed. The truth screamed in my mind. I was jealous. I wanted Elias. I am a monster. But I could not say it. To confess now would mean destroying my own life, taking on the very shunning I had subjected her to. The pride that had fueled the lie now locked it firmly in place. I told the truth, Abigail. I lied again, my voice trembling, avoiding her eyes. You must pray for forgiveness, not from me, but from God. She stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. Then she simply nodded. It wasn't a nod of agreement, it was a nod of absolute defeat. She realized, in that moment, that I would never set her free. She turned her back to me and walked away into the falling snow, her thin shoulders hunched against the cold. It was the last time she ever spoke to me. The winter of 1856 was the most brutal our county had seen in a decade. The snow drifted as high as the fence posts, and the wind off Lake Ontario howled through the floorboards of our farmhouses like a starving animal. In the foster home, that cold was not just a matter of weather. It was a physical manifestation of the hatred they now held for their eldest daughter. Abigail remained banished to the uninsulated attic. She was given barely enough wood to keep a small stove burning, and her meals were still taken alone, long after the rest of the family had retreated to the warmth of the parlor fire. The isolation and the despair systematically dismantled her immune system. By January, a deep, rattling cough had settled into her chest. In a community driven by a harsh, unforgiving theology, her illness was not viewed as a tragedy. It was viewed as the righteous judgment of an angry God. Her father, a man whose heart had been entirely calcified by his distorted faith, refused to send for the doctor in town. He believed that intervening in her suffering was akin to interfering with divine retribution. He commanded his wife and younger daughters to leave Abigail to her prayers and her repentance. I knew she was sick. The entire village knew. The gossip network that had so eagerly destroyed her reputation now morbidly tracked her physical decline. My mother would return from the mercantile, shaking her head with a grim, satisfied solemnity, reporting that Abigail Foster was spitting up blood, that the wages of sin were finally being paid in full. Every time I heard her name, a jolt of pure, sickening terror would violently shock my system. I would lie awake in my warm feather bed listening to the wind, imagining Abigail shivering in that drafty attic, coughing until her ribs cracked, dying from a broken heart that I had personally crushed. I wanted to go to her. I wanted to drag the town doctor to her house by his collar. I wanted to stand in the center of the church and scream the truth until my throat bled. But the cowardice that had birthed the lie now held me hostage. If I confessed, the wrath of the entire village would pivot instantly to me. My own father would likely turn me out into the snow. I was paralyzed by the instinct for self-preservation, watching the slow, agonizing execution of my best friend from behind the safety of my bedroom curtains. The end came in the bleak gray dawn of the 14th of February, 1857. I was in the kitchen, churning butter, when the heavy, mournful toll of the church bell began to ring across the frozen fields. It did not ring with the joyous, rapid cadence of a wedding. It rang with the slow, rhythmic strike of a death knell, one toll for every year of the deceased's life. I stopped churning. I stood perfectly still, counting the strikes in the freezing kitchen. 15, 16, 17. And then, silence. My knees gave out. I collapsed onto the hard plank floor, my hands clutching my stomach as a wave of violent nausea overtook me. I dragged myself to the back door and vomited into the snowbank. I had killed her. I had not used a weapon, but I was as much a murderer as any man hanging from a gallows. My jealousy, my spite, and my lie had put a 17-year-old girl into the frozen earth. Abigail's funeral was the most grotesque display of pious cruelty I have ever witnessed. She was not permitted to be buried in the main churchyard among the respectable families. Instead, her grave was dug in the far, neglected corner of the cemetery, near the wrought iron fence, a place usually reserved for unbaptized infants and suicides. The ground was so frozen that the gravediggers had to use pickaxes to break the earth, the sharp, metallic cracks echoing through the barren trees. The congregation attended not out of grief, but out of a grim sense of duty, a desire to witness the final closing of a shameful chapter. The minister did not offer words of comfort. He stood over the plain pine box and delivered a blistering, terrifying sermon on the consequences of female vanity and the inescapable fires of hell. He used Abigail as a prop, a cautionary tale to frighten the remaining young women of the village into absolute submission. I stood in the back row, my face hidden behind a thick black mourning veil. I looked at Abigail's parents, who stood with their heads bowed, displaying no visible tears, locked in their rigid, horrifying pride. I looked at the plain pine box, imagining the copper hair and the bright, beautiful laugh that was now silenced forever inside it. I dug my fingernails into the palms of my hands until they bled, desperately trying to ground myself against the overwhelming urge to throw myself into the open grave with her. I could not stay in that village. The guilt was a living, breathing monster that stalked me through the streets. Every time I walked past the Foster farm, every time I saw the bend in the creek where I had orchestrated her ruin, I felt as though I were losing my mind. I became obsessed with escape. My salvation, if you can call it that, arrived in the form of Henry Hayes, a 30-year-old merchant from Syracuse who had come to our village on business in the summer of 1858. Henry was a steady, unimaginative man, a man of ledgers and predictable routines. He was entirely devoid of the poetic spark that had drawn me to Elias Blackwood, but he represented the one thing I desperately needed, a way out. I courted him with a quiet, relentless determination. I played the role of the perfect, dutiful, pious farm girl to absolute perfection. He proposed within 3 months, and we were married in the autumn. I packed my trunks and left the village of my youth without shedding a single tear. I did not look back as the wagon carried me away. Truly, foolishly believed that changing my geography would change my soul. I believed that by moving to a growing city, by becoming a respectable merchant's wife, I could leave the ghost of Abigail Foster buried in that frozen, neglected corner of the churchyard. But I learned very quickly that you cannot run from a guilty conscience. The ghost did not stay in the graveyard. She packed her bags, climbed into the wagon, and traveled to Syracuse with me. My marriage to Henry Hayes was a transaction of convenience masquerading as a respectable union. We lived in a handsome two-story house on a paved street in Syracuse. We had gas lighting, a maid who came twice a week, and a parlor filled with heavy, expensive mahogany furniture. Henry was a good provider, a man who spoke little and demanded only that his home be orderly and his meals punctual. I played the role of the devoted, pious wife to absolute perfection. I kept the ledgers. I attended the First Presbyterian Church every Sunday. And I smiled politely at the other merchants' wives. I had everything the world told me a woman of my station should want. But a house built on the foundation of a murdered girl's bones can never truly be a home. It was merely a well-furnished tomb. The guilt was not a loud, dramatic thing that faded with the changing seasons. It was a slow, dripping poison that contaminated every joy I tried to grasp. I saw Abigail everywhere. I saw her copper hair in the crowded, bustling markets of the city. I heard her bright, unrestrained laugh echoing down the narrow brick alleyways when the wind blew off the lake. When the brutal winter snows came to Syracuse, paralyzing the city and piling in massive drifts against the window panes, I could not sleep. I would sit in the dark parlor, wrapped in a thick woolen quilt, shivering uncontrollably as I imagined her freezing to death in that uninsulated, unforgiving attic. Henry would find me there, trembling, and assume I suffered from a melancholic disposition. He would pat my shoulder with a heavy, uncomprehending hand, offer a cup of warm tea, and return to his bed entirely ignorant that he was married to a monster. The true, unyielding torment, however, began when I became a mother. Over the course of a decade, I bore 3 children, all of them girls: Sarah, Margaret, and little Josephine. When the midwife placed my firstborn daughter into my arms, the terror that seized me was so absolute it stole the breath from my lungs. I looked at her innocent, perfect face, and I did not feel the joyous, overwhelming rush of maternal love. I felt the crushing, terrifying certainty of divine retribution. I was convinced, with the absolute, unshakable faith of the guilty, that God was going to balance the scales. I had destroyed a daughter, so an angry, vengeful God would surely destroy mine. This paralyzing fear dictated every aspect of my motherhood. I became a warden rather than a mother. I watched my girls with a suffocating, paranoid intensity that bordered on madness. I forbade them from attending social dances, from walking alone in the city parks, from wearing anything that might draw the eye of a young man. If Sarah laughed too loudly in the parlor, I would silence her with a vicious, cutting reprimand, terrified that her joy would attract ruin. If Margaret showed even the slightest fondness for a neighborhood boy, I crushed it ruthlessly, lecturing her for hours on the innate wickedness of men and the fragile, easily shattered nature of a woman's virtue. I squeezed the life out of my own children, attempting to shield them from the very weapon I had wielded against Abigail. I thought I was protecting them, but I was merely projecting my own profound sickness onto their innocent lives. My daughters grew up fearing me, resenting me, and ultimately pulling away from me the moment they were of age to marry. They accepted the first respectable proposals they received, desperate to trade the suffocating prison of my house for the quiet distance of their own lives. I had saved them from the town gossip, but I had lost their hearts entirely. They do not know the real me. They only know the rigid, terrifyingly strict woman I became to outrun my own shadow. Now, I am 87 years old. Henry has been dead for over 2 decades, taken by a sudden stroke in his 65th year. My daughters visit me out of a dry, obligatory sense of duty. They sit in my parlor, carefully sipping tea and speak to me with the polite, strained voices one uses when addressing a difficult, unpredictable stranger. I have lived a long, prosperous, entirely barren life. The world calls me a respectable widow. The church calls me a faithful servant. But the mirror in my bedchamber calls me a liar, a coward, and a murderer. People speak of the cleansing power of time, but they are fools. Time does not cleanse a wound that has been sealed over dirt. It simply allows the infection to spread deeper into the bone until it consumes you from the inside out. I have prayed for forgiveness 1,000 times. I have spent countless hours on my arthritic knees, weeping into my hands, begging God to wash away the stain of that August night at the camp meeting. But the heavens have remained entirely silent, and I know exactly why. True repentance requires confession. It requires standing before the world, stripping away the armor of respectability, and dismantling the lie. But I have always been a coward. I was a coward at 17, too terrified of my own jealousy to speak the truth. And I am a coward at 87, too terrified of my daughter's disgust to finally unburden my soul. I will die soon. The doctor comes twice a week now, checking my failing heart with a grim, practiced efficiency. I am not afraid of the physical act of dying. I welcome the dark. But I am terrified of what comes after. I do not believe I will see the pearly gates, nor do I believe I will hear the singing of angels. I believe that when I draw my final rattling breath, I will wake up in a frozen, neglected corner of a country graveyard. I believe I will have to look into the hollow, betrayed eyes of Abigail Foster, and I will have to spend eternity feeling the exact measure of the agonizing cold I inflicted upon her. That is my confession. That is the true legacy of the quiet, respectable Clara Hayes. I told a lie to steal a man who never loved me, and in doing so, I destroyed the only person who ever did.